This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Monterey Bay Knives Kain. That's Kain. And this is a disappointing knife. So I'm not here to waste your time, and I don't want you to waste your hard-earned money. So let's get right into the background and specs. So Monterey Bay Knives, or MBK, is run by Sanford Owen, here, and Ray, I think it's Laconico, out of Carmel, California, which is right by Monterey Bay. The company was founded in 2017, and the majority of their knives are Chinese-made production knives with designs by Ray or other well-known custom makers like Gary McGinnis or Peter Carey. I don't have any, actually I do have one of their production knives somewhere, but it's buried in a desk somewhere. I'll review it at some point. But over the last couple of years, they've started to venture into USA-made production knives. And this one is the Kain, which is designed by Sanford Owen. They've also done the Sea Otter, the River Otter, the Sea Lion, and they've also done an XL version, the KXL of this Kain. This is the smallest one, and this is also came out, I think, at the same time as another version of this knife done by CJRB, a much lower cost production version. That one's $30, $40. This one is $400. These USA-made MBKs, Monterey Bay Knives, have been gathering quite a bit of hype over the past few years. And while the market has settled down recently, the Kain will usually sell out within 24 hours whenever a new run is posted for sale. And their Sea Otter and their Sea Lion and River Otter variants can sell out in a matter of minutes and usually go for pretty close to their MSRP on the secondary market. So these are hot knives right now, as are a lot of USA-made high-quality production folders. So the Kain here has a 3-inch blade of S90V. It's actually not marked anywhere I can see. Oh wait, there it is. Yeah, there's your S90V. The handle is 4 inches long. It weighs 2.7 inches, so just under an ounce an inch. Your blade stock here is 135 thousandths. The knife is fully titanium with an aluminum oxide and stonewash treatment on both the handle and the blade. So even though, this is titanium, this is steel, they put the same treatment on everything, so it all looks pretty much the same. This is a frame lock running on phosphor bronze washers. Let's do a couple quick size comparisons. So here it is compared to your Spyderco Paramilitary 2. So you can see it's quite a bit larger than that. Here it is compared to a TRM Atom. And now give me 1 second here. Here it is compared to your small Sabenza right here and your large Sabenza. So you can see that basically this is a roughly small Sabenza size knife, which makes it a pretty small knife. Let's get these other ones out of the way. I was excited to get this knife in hand. I'm always excited to see more USA-made high-end production knives, or frankly, more USA-made production knives at any level. And I've been watching MBK's foray into USA-made models with great interest. On paper, this design is right up my alley. It's small, it's pocket-friendly, with a slim, pointy blade, washer action on thumb studs, and a simple utilitarian aesthetic. I should love this knife. But as you can sense the butt coming, almost every aspect of this knife has failed to meet my expectations. So let's get into why. So first, we'll start with these handles. So they're full titanium, which is a good start, and this blasted then stonewash finish is nice. It's very similar to the finish I talked about in my last review on these rock scale scales. Rock scales is a little smoother. I like it a little better. This one keeps a little bit more of the grit from the blast in there, but still, it's a nice finish. It's very similar. This one is very similar to a Hinderer working finish. This finish here feels a lot different than a working finish, even if it looks similar. This feels very, very similar to Hinderer's working finish, which I believe is done the exact same way. And it does give you a nice bit of grip. One of the benefits of this is it's still got a bit of that grippiness to it without being quite as grippy as, sorry for the noise, as Chris Reeves sort of sandblasted. This one's had a bit of pocket wear, so it started to sort of have that natural stone wash, but it's a bit less grippy than your Chris Reeve finish. But these are very simple scales bordering on basic. They remind me of the sorts of scales that we saw in mid-tech knives 7 or 8 years ago. And I don't mean that in a positive way. We've got two completely flat scales. There's no contouring, no rounding, and they've just got a simple, constant bevel the whole way around. When I say a constant bevel, I'm going to keep bringing the Chris Reeves in here. Okay, so Chris Reeve, when they do their bevels, you can see this is a variable bevel. The bevel changes in thickness as you go around the knife. It's most pronounced up here, but there's subtle changes in bevel thickness the whole way. It's very subtle. A lot of people won't even notice it, but it is just another little level of design. This is the exact same bevel. It's literally like you just took your CAD file and you said, okay, put a bevel here, and you just beveled the whole handle scale, which frankly is probably how it was done. There's no internal milling on either side. There's no variance in thickness, so it doesn't like slim out toward the butt or anything like that. The lines are very simple. Again, to keep pulling out the Sebenza as a comparison here, you see, the Sebenza gets talked about as a very basic, as sort of a straight-handled knife. It is not straight. It's actually a very subtle, not even that subtle now that I'm so used to looking at it, bow on both the top and the bottom that leads this handle to pinch right at, where your finger's laying, and bow out toward the butt of the knife and bow out toward the front of the knife. Those curves dramatically improve the ergonomics of this knife and frankly just make it a whole lot more interesting to look at and hold. Conversely, like this piece back here, pretty much straight lines, pretty much parallel the whole way back. It's sort of just a stick with a couple curves in it. I mean, it's not just the Sebenza that does that. If I pulled out one of my, actually I've got a full titanium one here, they'll show it better. One of my Jack Wolf knives. You can see there's subtle curves everywhere. You can see there's that, variable bevel all the way around here. It's more dramatic here, but you can see there's all those little extra design details that just make this a little bit more of a complicated shape than it needed to be. You just sort of block this off. Those subtle details just aren't present here. And you know what? That's fine. A knife design doesn't have to be complicated, but if you're going to keep your design simple and charge $400 for your knife, you had better absolutely nail the execution. But ergonomically, this handle is a mess. It looks like it's going to be nice enough. You've got a decent finger guard up here. So there's a nice curve for your index finger to sit into, but everything behind this is basically a thin, slightly curved, flat stick. And even for my medium hand, so I wear a large glove, medium-sized hands, it just doesn't give me enough to hold on to. This sort of disappears in my palm, and like when I close my hands on it, it never feels like it's sitting neatly in my palm, and it provides very little grip or security. Anytime I have to push this knife hard at all, I gotta clamp down, really just push my hand into it to maintain control over this knife. If you've got something like to use an extreme case, actually no, I won't use an extreme case. I've got a review coming up of the UKPK. This is also a small knife, about the same overall size. You can see it's got much more dramatic curves here. Like many small Spydercos, this thing is an ergonomic dream because all of these curves keep your hand locked in place, even though there isn't that much real estate. This big flat bottom here, this big stick toward the back, it just doesn't do it. It's just ergonomically not good. If I choke up into a pinch grip, where I'm putting sort of my fingers on the blade, holding it like a paring knife, the ergonomics are better. My middle finger anchors here and my back two fingers pinch around. This feels a little more natural when it's sort of sitting on the inside of my knuckles here. But when I'm doing this, I'm taking an already short and small blade and making there even less blade. You know, if I wanted a folding paring knife, this wouldn't be bad for those sort of very delicate cuts. But the problem is, then you want that knife to be very, very slicey. And we'll get to blade performance in a second, but that's not good either. To finish on sort of the ergonomics, this handle would be greatly improved. Again, let's bring out our Spyderco comparison. This is literally just a knife that I had hanging around. To get another comparison about the same size, look at, you know, your ZT. I guess these the 0235. I get the 235 and 230 swapped all the time. This is a smaller knife that's ergonomically better. It does it by being just a little bit, just feeling a little fuller in the hand because it's a little taller, and just having more thoughtfully designed curves. This is an Nien's Onso knife, so of course it's going to be nicely designed. This thing here needs one of two things. It either needs a belly, like Spyderco has here, where, you know, this gives you a little hump for your hands to hold on to, or it needs to curve down more toward the butt. So this is curving down. Let me get one more comparison here. So another very good small knife that does it with curves is your Javelina Jack from, and actually this is a very good comparison here. So your Kain keeps this straight. Your Javelina Jack keeps curving downward. So even though this is a very simple knife, that downward curve wraps around your pinky, wraps into the back of your palm, and makes this feel very secure in hand feeling. It's also contoured, so it just feels nicer in general. This thing, it just feels like holding on to an annoying little stick. Like, it's just not good in the hand. But then, and so, you know, like, ergonomically, it's just not good. And then the last thing, while I'm sort of bitching about the ergonomics, when this knife is closed, with where this thumb stud is placed, and I'll talk about the action later, but you have to anchor this into the butt of your hand, and there's just not really quite enough space for my thumb to comfortably get under this thumb stud. Can I do it? Yes, but I'm really like holding on with these back two fingers, holding on to the butt of the knife to try to keep it from flying out of my hand. It's just not pleasant. It's the sort of thing that if I do it too many times, it feels like it's going to give me tendonitis. There is nothing about the ergonomics of this knife that I like. Again, it needs a bigger curve toward the butt, or it needs a belly. Either of those could probably salvage it, but as it stands right now, it's not comfortable to hold. Now, the other thing, if we bring out our comparisons here, if you've got a small knife, especially if it's a small knife that's in sort of the gentleman's carry area of things, the other way to make the ergonomics less of an issue is to make it super duper slicey. Because, you know, the amount that the ergonomics are a problem on a knife really comes down to how much force the material you're trying to cut is exerting on the blade. If you got a knife like this Jack Wolf here that is ground super, super thin, anything you're cutting through is going to provide very little resistance. So even if this knife were ergonomically worse than it is, it would still pass through material easily, and so you can still grip it lightly and it will still feel nice in the hand. Same thing for this ZT. Part of the reason it works so well is this thing is actually ground to cut. So for the light duty tasks that you would use a double detent folder like this for, it does the job just fine. The ergonomics are good enough. But the blade on the Kain is not even close to being a slicer. On paper, this looks like a serviceable design. It's sleek, it's pointy, and has a nice gradual curve down across the top, a tip that sits a little bit above the pivot, and a nice full belly across the bottom. It's saber ground, but it's pretty close to a full flat grind, and it does carry most of its stock thickness over the tip, but so you do have a pretty thick tip out here, all considered, but you know, you do have a decent amount of space to get down to the edge. So if I look at this blade, I see a nice usable tip, a decent amount of space to thin out the stock, and enough cutting area for slicing. All the ingredients for what is, in theory, a pretty good, pretty attractive EDC blade. But the stock is too thick and the grind is too shallow. 135 thousandths thick on the blade stock, is nearing the stock thickness of the Para 3, and that's a knife that has about twice as much space to drop from the back of the knife, from the spine of the knife, down to the edge. This is a full flat grind, not a hollow grind, and it's a fairly shallow one at that. If you look at, I usually can't get this shot there. If you look at sort of your choil shot equivalent, you can see this is pretty wedge-like. Basically, this is an edge that feels Hinderer-esque, and that is not a compliment. If you've seen any of my Hinderer reviews, a Hinderer-esque edge is one that doesn't really cut. This thing chews, not slices through paper and cardstock, and anytime I try to cut cardboard with it, I've actually given up after a few cuts because it has struggled to make even basic cuts. The damn thing just doesn't cut well. And when you combine the poor cutting performance with those weak ergonomics, it's a knife that's a bear to cut with, that doesn't like to stay in the hand, and it's just not a useful knife. I never carry this knife alone because I always knew after just a few cuts, I'd be reaching for whatever else was in my pocket. And on top of this, it feels like there were corners cut throughout the design. I already talked about these very simple bevels. The lack of internal milling is a disappointment. Now, it's not a heavy knife, and that only would have shaved a couple tenths of an ounce off, but I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for that extra effort on a $400 knife. Your pivot screws and sort of the holes that are drilled into the scales to seat them are very simple, and you can see they don't even quite sit flush. Again, to bring back my Sabenza here, you see how those fit very nicely and evenly with the scales, how the bevel on the screw, or on the screw head, it's not really a bevel, but you know, the shape of the screw head just nicely, neatly meets the scale here. On the Kain, you can see that unchamfered edge where the screws sit. They're recessed, I don't know, 32nd of an inch, a tiny amount, but they're recessed a little too far into the scale, and they didn't chamfer the hole, so you've just got a unfinished edge sitting there, a visible sharp edge. And then last but not least, this pivot itself is the single most squirrely pivot I have felt in a long time. This pivot absolutely loves to walk itself out of position, to just loosen itself through use. It's also the first pivot I have handled in years that even when I put blue Loctite on it, it will not stay in place. When this pivot gets even a little loose, the blade will have play. I've got it a tiny bit loose now, or it's where it is now, and there is a tiny bit of blade play. And if I tighten it any more, the action will get slow and stiff. It's frustrating. All of this stuff, if this was, say, an American Blade Works that cost something in the high 200s or low 300s for American made, I might look past these issues. I still frankly wouldn't. And honestly, I don't think even American Blade Works has a lot of those issues, but it would be easier to forgive. But I keep bringing back the Sabenza because you're paying $400 for the Kain, and that's $25 less than a Sabenza. So we know exactly what the standard of quality is for American made at this price point. And having those sorts of issues is just not acceptable as you get closer and closer to Sabenza pricing territory, because if you can't get those things right, what are you paying for? So the last thing to talk about is the action, which is fine. The Foster bronze washers on this are nice and smooth. You know, this is, you can snap it out if you want to. It is definitely a slow roller on the close, though, as I said, it's very pivot sensitive. The detent is pretty stiff. And that's how it does get it to flick out. You can slow roll it if you want to, for sure. The action in both directions is broken in nicely with time. The thumb studs are your standard TI connector studs, or some very close facsimile. And they provide pretty decent grip here, as they do in every other knife we've seen with TI connector studs on them. But even this action is marred by some quality and design issues. As I mentioned before, the thumb stud placement is a little awkward. It feels too far back. I know with this design, they couldn't put it further forward, but Two issues. One, when you're holding the knife, it's a little awkward, more than a little awkward, to sort of pinch this thin butt of the knife and get your thumb in position. It feels like I have to press way too hard with these fingers to keep control of the knife while I flick it out. And then on top of that, the angle that my thumb is naturally pushing when I just hold the knife is like that direction. It's like that. It's nowhere close to perpendicular to the pivot, which is what you want. And so most of my force is not actually going toward opening the knife. It ends up being an action that is just harder to open than it should be. It flies out nicely once you break that detent, but it's harder to open than it should be. You can't fix that with this design because you can't move the thumb stud any further up, but that just means that it's a design flaw. Now, one of the ways they compensated for this is they kept the lock bar tension fairly light, almost very light. That is one way to make your detent a little bit weaker, but it also means that you don't get that nice clean break you get on something like a TRM Atom or Neutron, let alone any other, higher quality knife where you get that nice thwack, that nice crisp opening action. It's fixing a problem by creating another problem. The action is fine, but much like everything else on this knife, it feels less than what it could have been. And I don't like writing negative reviews, especially about, I guess they are still an up-and-coming brand like MBK. They've been around since 2017, but their American production operation is still growing. They're sort of now where McNee's Knives was 2 or 3 years ago. And I love that MBK is sincerely committed to American manufacturing, but there's no way that I can recommend this knife for anything remotely close to the $400 they're asking for it. And really, it does come down to bringing out the Sebenza again. The Sebenza is $25 more than the Kain. For that, you get a fit, a finish, and you get an action that is worlds better. You get significantly better ergonomics, and you get a best-in-class grind. These knives are not in the same league. I can't even reduce, let's flip it over so that they sit properly. I can't even reduce my complaints to fit and finish issues, because even if you fixed all those little fit and finish issues, even if you made the blade grind better, even if you just fixed that pivot, even if you just made it so that, it was just a smidge nicer everywhere, the design still needs more time in the oven. This blade shape is very nice, but the ergonomics are not good. The Kain needs a fatter butt, more curves, or it needs to double down on a gentleman's carry roll and slim down this blade stock substantially. As it stands, it's a small knife that doesn't either do precise slicey work like something like your Javelina, or be a more general EDC like your small Sebenza. It doesn't do either one well, and so it ends up being very difficult to recommend. I'm rooting for MBK, and these knives seem to be selling just fine. So I do hope that we see a better Kain or a better knife than the Kain in the future, but today's version just doesn't cut it. This has been Clark the Knife, and I'll see you on the next one.